Hello, my friends, and welcome back to Western Tales Memories. Today, I want to share with you a story about the kind of redemption only the frontier could carve. A story about a man who thought he was buying silence, and a woman who taught him what worth truly means. It happened in the summer of 1886, in a place called Cedar Hollow, Montana, a town of wind, whiskey, and worn-out dreams. The kind of place where dust never really settles. It just waits for the next sorrow to stir it up again. That morning, the sun rose hot and merciless over the main street. Wagons lined the square, and men leaned against railings with the dull hunger of those who'd seen too much. There was to be an auction, horses, tools, maybe a rifle or two. But by noon, something else had been dragged into the sale. A trapper named Wynne stumbled forward, whiskey dripping from his breath. He wasn't selling a mule or a saddle. He was selling his daughter. The crowd went still. Some laughed, some turned away, but no one stopped him. She stood beside him, Clara Wynne, barely 20, thin as willow bark, her dress torn where the sun had burned through the fabric. She said nothing, not a plea, not a word. Only her eyes moved, sharp, clear, alive. There was defiance there, like the last coal in a dying fire. The trapper slapped her arm. "Don't just stand there," he slurred. "You're worth something to somebody." The men around him chuckled uneasily. One spat, another muttered, "Ain't right." But still, no one stepped forward, until Henry Dalton did. Henry was a farmer, widowed 5 years. His hands were rough, his eyes quiet, the kind of man who spoke less than the wind but carried a decency that couldn't be hidden. He'd come to town for seed grain, not salvation. But when he saw Clara standing there, a soul being traded like a saddle strap, something in him shifted. He reached for his coin pouch. "How much?" he asked. The trapper blinked. "Unsteady. Take her off my hands for $10. She eats more'n she's worth." A laugh rippled through the onlookers. Henry counted out the coins and dropped them into the man's shaking palm. The sound of metal hitting skin was louder than thunder. The trapper grinned, tipped his hat to the crowd, and staggered toward the saloon, free of the one thing he should never have sold. For a moment, the square was silent. Then a horse whinnied somewhere down the street, and the day went on like nothing had happened. Clara stood still. The dust curled around her boots. Henry said quietly, "Come on, miss. Let's get you out of here." She looked at him not with gratitude, not even with anger, but with something harder to name, a kind of question. Then she followed him to the wagon, climbed aboard, without a word. As they rode away, the town shrank behind them, the saloon, the laughter, the sin of it all, swallowed by the golden emptiness of the plains. Henry drove without speaking. The reins creaked in his hands. He could feel her silence sitting beside him like a weight he didn't know how to carry. When the wind rose, lifting the dust into a pale veil between them, she finally turned to look at him. Her voice was soft, but steady. "You didn't have to do that." Henry kept his eyes on the horizon. "No," he said, "but someone had to." The wagon wheels groaned over the dry earth. Behind them, Cedar Hollow faded into the heat. Ahead, only the endless prairie waited, and with it, the beginning of a story neither of them could have imagined. He thought he was buying silence, but what he bought was his own reckoning. And that's how the tale of Henry Dalton and Clara Wynne began, under the harsh sun of Montana, where even the dust remembers mercy. The road north out of Cedar Hollow was nothing more than a line of wagon ruts cutting through dust and silence. Henry Dalton guided the horses at an easy pace, not saying much because there wasn't much to say. Beside him, Clara Wynne sat straight-backed on the wooden seat, her hands folded tightly around a small brass locket she hadn't opened once. The prairie stretched forever. Wind bent the tall grass like an ocean in motion. Sometimes the sky looked too big for the earth, and a man could feel small enough to disappear into it. Hours passed. The sun baked the wagon boards until they burned to the touch. Henry reached into his satchel and pulled out a canteen. "Water?" he asked. She didn't look at him, didn't even blink. He tried again, quieter this time. "You'll need it. It's a long road yet." She shook her head once. "No, thank you." It was the first time he'd heard her voice since the town square, soft, measured, and far older than 20 years. He nodded and said nothing more. The wagon creaked on, each turn of the wheel marking a mile further from shame, though neither of them knew what waited ahead. When the sun dropped low and the air turned amber, Henry pulled the horses off the road near a dry creek bed. The ground was cracked like old pottery, and the only sound was the sigh of wind through the sage. He unpacked a small sack bread, a bit of salted pork, a handful of beans. "Eat," he said. "You'll feel steadier." Again, she refused. Her stomach might have been empty, but her will was not. He wanted to tell her that she didn't owe him trust, or thanks, or even a word. But he'd learned long ago that some wounds don't close with talk, they close with time. Night fell heavy and blue. The stars came out, sharp and cold as nails hammered into the sky. Somewhere in the hills, coyotes started to sing long, mournful notes that carried over the emptiness. Henry sat near the small fire he'd built, watching the flames catch and fall. Clara sat a few yards away, knees drawn up, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. He said, almost gently, "You're safe now." Her reply came slow, but it cut straight through the quiet. Safe isn't the same as free. The words hung there, honest, unflinching. Henry looked down at his calloused hands, the firelight tracing the lines and scars across his knuckles. He didn't argue, because she was right. After that, they didn't speak again. The fire burned low. The night pressed close. He lay on the ground beside the wagon, listening to the wind move through the grass like the breath of something ancient and unseen. When dawn came, the world was washed pale. A chill clung to the air, and the horses snorted clouds of steam. Henry rose first, poured water into a tin cup, and handed it to her. This time, she took it one careful sip, then another. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice rasping from disuse. He gave a small nod and began loading the wagon. But when he turned, he saw that she wasn't climbing aboard. "I'll walk," she said simply. "The road's long," he answered. "I've been walking my whole life," she replied, and started north beside the wagon before he could find words to stop her. He watched her for a moment, her small figure against the endless prairie, skirt brushing the tall grass, hair coming loose in the wind. There was something steady about her stride, something that said she had chosen to keep her dignity, even here, even now. As the sun climbed higher, the two of them moved together, one on foot, one on the reins, bound not by obligation, but by a quiet understanding neither could name yet. Henry glanced at her once, meaning to speak, but her expression stopped him. It wasn't blank. It was composed like someone who had built walls, not from anger, but from the need to stay whole. He realized then that her silence wasn't emptiness, it was presence. The kind that fills a space, demands respect, and makes a man question the sound of his own thoughts. For the first time in years, Henry felt something stir in him, not desire, not pity, but a strange kind of reverence. He had seen storms break mountains, but he had never seen strength so quiet. The miles rolled beneath the wagon wheels, and as the morning wind carried the scent of rain somewhere far ahead, Henry Dalton began to wonder if perhaps what he'd bought that day in Cedar Hollow wasn't silence at all, but the beginning of something that might one day speak the truth back into his life. The road narrowed as the land dipped toward Blue Willow Creek, a trickle of water glinting beneath cottonwoods and sky. That's where Henry Dalton's farm stood, if stood was the right word, for a house that leaned with the wind and sighed at its own bones. The roof sagged in places. The fences bowed under the weight of seasons. It was a home built on grief and stubborn hands that refused to let go. When the wagon stopped, Clara climbed down without waiting for him to offer help. She looked around, her eyes tracing the cracked porch, the empty corral, the half-mended gate. And though she said nothing, her silence felt like the kind of seeing that cuts straight through paint and plaster to the truth of a place. Inside, the air smelled of dust, ashes, and old bread. The rooms were quiet, too quiet, like a church after the last hymn has faded. On the mantel, a small photograph showed a woman holding two children. The woman's smile was faint but kind. Henry cleared his throat. "My wife," he said softly. "She passed. Years ago." Clara only nodded. She didn't say she was sorry. Somehow, that made it easier to breathe. Two children peered from the doorway: Eli, 12, with his father's square jaw and a glare too old for his age, and June, 9, hiding behind his shoulder, curious but gentle-eyed. "This is Miss Wynne," Henry said. "She'll be staying a while." Eli's voice came sharp. "We don't need help." Henry's gaze was steady. "We do." Clara met the boy's stare. "Then I'll try not to get in your way," she said simply. June tugged on her brother's sleeve and whispered, "She talks nice." The first days passed like cautious weather. Clara spoke little. She swept, cooked, mended, scrubbed. No fuss, no questions. Just quiet motion, the kind that restores a place without anyone noticing until the air smells cleaner and the floor creaks softer. In the evenings, she'd stand by the sink, washing dishes while the wind brushed the curtains. Henry would find himself listening not to her voice, but to the rhythm she brought. A steady hum of ordinary grace. Eli kept his distance. He worked the barn, slammed doors, muttered under his breath when he thought no one could hear. But the more he watched her patch torn curtains or polish the rust from an old kettle, the less sure his anger became. One afternoon, he tore his only good shirt, climbing the fence. When Clara found it draped across a chair, she brought it back, neatly stitched. "A man who works," she said quietly, handing it to him, "earns more than dust on his pride." He didn't answer, but later, Henry saw the boy wearing that same shirt to supper, collar straight, eyes lowered but calmer. The line would come back to him again someday, like a lesson he hadn't known he'd been taught. June, on the other hand, took to Clara right away. In the soft glow of lamplight, she'd crawl into Clara's lap with a book full of tattered pages and ask her to read. Clara's voice was low and deliberate, each word touched by patience. Sometimes Henry would linger in the hallway, leaning against the frame, watching the two of them under the golden flicker of the lamp, his daughter's hair shining, Clara's face serene. He didn't know when exactly it happened, but the house began to change. The air didn't feel so hollow. The walls didn't echo as sharply. There was laughter again, small at first, then real. Even the mornings felt different. The smell of baking bread replaced the sour scent of neglect. A vase of wild flowers, nothing fancy, just color and care, appeared on the table one day, and Henry found himself smiling for no reason at all. Still, he didn't understand what had shifted, only that something broken had quietly begun to mend. It wasn't a miracle, not the kind preachers talked about on Sundays. It was slower, humbler, like frost melting under the first light of spring. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind whispered against the shutters, Henry would stand in the doorway of that small room, once his wife's, now Clara's, and see the lamplight glowing faintly through the crack beneath her door. He'd think of the long road that brought her here, of the silence she carried, and of how peace could walk into a man's life without asking permission. He didn't call it love, not yet. But for the first time in years, Henry Dalton slept with the feeling that tomorrow might hold something worth waking for. By the time autumn brushed gold across the valley, word of Clara Wynne had already traveled farther than the wind. In places like Cedar Hollow, gossip moved faster than the mail and weighed twice as much. For weeks she had stayed on the farm, working, mending, teaching June to braid her hair and Eli to tie proper knots. But sooner or later, every soul in the territory had to come into town. And so one Saturday morning, Henry hitched the wagon and said simply, "We're low on flour." The air was sharp, the streets busy. Farmers traded grain, women traded news, and every tongue seemed loose enough to wag. When Henry stepped down from the wagon, Clara followed, her dress plain but clean, a ribbon of faded blue tying back her hair. She carried herself like someone who had decided not to shrink for anyone ever again. At first, the murmurs were faint, like insects in tall grass. Then they gathered shape. There she is, the girl he bought. Dalton finally found a bargain. "I heard he paid less than a saddle." Henry heard them too. He didn't speak, but the muscle in his jaw tightened. Clara kept walking beside him, straight-backed, unhurried. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was armor. Inside the general store, the bell above the door tinkled. The smell of flour, lamp oil, and old wood filled the room. Behind the counter stood Mrs. Fairchild, the banker's widow, a woman who wore judgment the way others wore perfume. She eyed Clara like she was measuring fabric she had no intention of buying. "Well," she said, loud enough for every shopper to hear, so the stories were true. Mr. Dalton finally brought home his purchase. A few chuckles rippled through the room. Someone pretended to cough. Another looked away. Clara didn't move. She simply met Mrs. Fairchild's stare, calm as still water. Her hands rested at her sides, her shoulders unbowed. That quiet poise did more than words ever could. It unsettled the room. Henry set the sack of grain on the counter with deliberate care. His voice, when it came, was low but carried the weight of a hammer striking iron. "Ma'am," he said, "if dignity could be sold, I'd buy the lot of you out." The laughter died. The store went still. Even the clock on the wall seemed to pause. Mrs. Fairchild's mouth opened, then closed again. Her cheeks flushed crimson. Henry didn't wait for an answer. He paid for the supplies, nodded to the clerk, and turned toward the door. Clara followed him out into the sunlight, her steps steady, her eyes bright with something new, pride, maybe, or the fragile spark of being seen for who she truly was. Outside, the street had gone strangely quiet. Faces that once sneered now softened, uncertain. A few men tipped their hats. One woman smiled, hesitant but sincere. As the wagon rolled away, the wind lifted a swirl of dust behind them, erasing footprints, erasing words. Back on the farm that evening, the house smelled of stew and wood smoke. Eli argued with June about chores. Henry mended a harness, and Clara stood by the window, watching the last light fade from the hills. When Eli said something half funny and half foolish, she laughed. It wasn't loud, just a quick, startled sound, as if laughter had been waiting too long and forgot how to behave. The room stilled. Even Henry looked up, caught off guard by the gentleness of it. It was a sound clean as spring water, the kind that makes a man remember there's still good left in the world. Later, when the children had gone to bed and the night wind tapped softly at the panes, Henry sat alone by the hearth, thinking of that moment. He realized he'd lived years without laughter, his or anyone else's, and hadn't known how heavy silence could become until it broke. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the creak of the house and the faint hum of a woman's voice in the next room, humming a tune older than memory. The warmth that filled him wasn't the fire's doing. Out there, somewhere beyond the dark fields, the town of Cedar Hollow still whispered its stories. They could keep them. Henry Dalton had his own. The town saw a purchase. He saw a beginning. The summer that year came hard and dry. By late August, the grass around Blue Willow Creek had turned the color of old parchment, brittle enough to burn from a single spark. Every morning Henry watched the sky for rain and saw only more heat. Every night the horizon glowed faintly red from distant fires that never quite reached them until the night it did. It began with thunder that had no rain behind it, only anger. A bolt split the far ridge, and for a moment the world turned white. Then came the smell, sharp, bitter, final. Smoke. Henry stepped out onto the porch and saw the fire climbing fast across the hills, racing the wind. By the time he shouted for Eli, the first embers were already floating down like dying stars. He and his boy ran for the barn. The animals screamed inside the sound of panic, pure and wild. Henry grabbed a bucket, but he might as well have been throwing water at the sun. The flames were alive, hungry. "Get the horses!" he yelled. Eli hesitated, eyes wide with terror. "Pa, it's too much!" But Henry was already in motion, pulling open the doors, choking on the smoke that rolled out like a wave. Through the chaos, he didn't see Clara until she was already inside, skirt hem dark with soot, face streaked, moving through the haze with calm fury. She wasn't screaming. She was leading. The mare first, then a calf that could barely walk. Her hands shook, but she didn't stop. "Clara!" Henry shouted, but his voice vanished into the roar. For one endless second he lost sight of her, swallowed by the smoke. His heart stuttered. He plunged in after her, feeling heat claw at his skin, the air thick enough to chew. He found her near the far stall, one hand on the horse's neck, coughing so hard she could barely stand. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the door, dragging both of them through fire and ash until the cool night slapped their faces. They collapsed beside the fence, gasping, blackened by soot. The wind howled, carrying sparks over their heads like a shower of orange snow. Eli ran water from the trough, splashing their faces, the animals stumbling free behind them. When the last flame cracked and folded inward, the barn still stood scarred, but upright, the roof steaming, the wood smoldering in long, weary sighs. For a moment, there was only the sound of breathing theirs and the earth's. Henry turned to her, voice raw from smoke and fear. "You should have stayed back." Clara wiped the ash from her cheek, eyes fierce even through exhaustion. "You didn't buy a servant, Mr. Dalton," she said quietly. "You brought home someone who won't run." The words hit him harder than any flame. They weren't pride, they were truth. And in that truth, something in Henry Dalton cracked wide open. He looked at her, the soot clinging to her hair, the tremor in her shoulders, the courage in her eyes, and saw not the girl he'd once rescued, but the woman who had rescued him in ways he didn't yet have words for. The fire was dying, but inside him, something new had begun to burn, steady, clean, alive. Eli stood off to the side, staring at the barn, whispering, "We saved it." Henry put a hand on his son's shoulder, but his eyes stayed on Clara. She was kneeling beside the calf, stroking its neck, murmuring soft things no one else could hear. The night smelled of smoke and rain that hadn't fallen. Overhead, lightning flickered again, distant now, just a reminder. When Clara finally looked up, Henry met her gaze and nodded once, slow and full of meaning. It wasn't gratitude. It was recognition, the kind two people share when they've crossed through something dangerous and come out changed. He tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come. She seemed to understand anyway. She gave him a small, tired smile, the kind that forgives everything without saying so. The barn had been saved, yes, but what had really survived was harder to name. Something unspoken had passed between them in that fire, forged in heat and fear, and the kind of bravery that doesn't shout its own name. Later, when the embers cooled and the prairie lay quiet again, Henry sat on the fence watching the first pale edge of dawn. The smoke rose in thin ribbons toward a sky washed clean. Beside him, Clara stood barefoot in the dew, the locket at her throat catching the faintest glint of morning light. He thought of what she'd said, "You brought home someone who won't run," and realized that, for the first time in years, he didn't want to run either. By the time winter loosened its grip on Blue Willow Creek, the land had changed, and so had everyone who lived upon it. The fire was long behind them now, but its lesson had stayed. From ashes and toil, Henry Dalton rebuilt not only his barn, but his faith in life itself. The new barn stood proud under the Montana sky, its walls straight, the wood honey bright in the sun. Every plank seemed to carry the mark of gratitude. The fences were mended, the pastures green again, and laughter had returned to the Dalton place like a bird that had finally remembered its way home. In town, the whispers had gone quiet. Folks still remembered the day the widow Fairchild's words were silenced by Henry's calm voice, and the night Clara Wynne ran into the fire when every man turned away. Those stories changed something in Cedar Hollow. Now, when Clara walked through town, heads nodded instead of turning aside. Some even smiled. On Sundays, she gathered the children of the valley under the old willow by the creek, where its branches fell like a curtain of green lace. There, she taught them to read the sons and daughters of ranch hands, trappers, and widows alike. Her voice carried softly through the summer air, spelling out hope letter by letter. The same men who once mocked her would sometimes stop at a distance to listen, hats in hand, not sure why the sound of it felt holy. Henry watched her often from the porch, not out of pride or ownership, but in quiet awe. He'd see the way she crouched to meet a child's gaze, the way her laughter blended with the breeze, and he'd think, that's what grace looks like when it chooses to stay. By midsummer, the Dalton farm had become what it was always meant to be: alive, generous, whole. The horses were strong, the crops thick and golden. Eli worked with purpose now, quoting his father's words back to him when chores grew long. June's laughter filled the kitchen, and Clara's steady presence bound it all together like sunlight through glass. One evening, as dusk melted into a soft rain, Henry stepped out onto the porch. The world smelled of earth and clover. Fireflies winked along the fence line. Clara sat in her usual chair, mending a torn sleeve, her hair lit by the last embers of day. He stood there a moment, just watching, until she looked up with that patient half-smile that always disarmed him. He cleared his throat. "You were never something I bought," he said quietly. "You were the prayer I didn't know," I said. The sound of the rain filled the space between them. She set her work aside, eyes glimmering with tears that caught the light like tiny mirrors. "Then you already have your answer," she whispered. They sat together as the sky rumbled far off over the ridge. Lightning flickered faintly in the distance, not the cruel kind that brings fire, but the gentle kind that just reminds the earth it's alive. His hand found hers, rough skin against smooth, old scars meeting new grace. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. For a long time, they simply listened to the horses shifting in the barn, to the creak of the porch, to the sound of rain finding its way home to the soil. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was full of all that had been lost, and all that had been found again. And as the night settled around the Dalton farm, a voice steady and sure carried through the wind one final truth. In a land where worth was measured by cattle and coin, a man found his soul in the quiet strength of a woman who cost him nothing and gave him everything. The fire was long gone, but its light remained in the laughter of a child, in the glow of lamplight through the window, in the steady beating of hearts that had finally found peace. Thank you, my friends, for listening to this story tonight on Western Tales Memories. If it touched your heart, I'd love to know where you're listening from, maybe out in Wyoming, maybe down in Texas, or somewhere far across the ocean where the prairie still calls your spirit home. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell us what part of this story spoke to you most. And if you believe in love that endures and redemption that still walks the West, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss the next tale beneath these wide, whispering skies. Until next time, ride steady, keep your faith strong, and remember every story of the West is, at its heart, a story of the soul.